The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty settlement of Pine Ridge when young Tommy Martinez came running through the wooden gates, his bare feet kicking up clouds of dirt. His dark eyes were wide with terror, and tears had carved clean tracks down his dust-covered cheeks. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 years old, but he carried himself with the serious burden of someone who had witnessed something no child should ever see. The settlement was just beginning to stir with the day's activities. Women emerged from their small wooden homes to hang laundry on makeshift lines, while men prepared for another day of working the harsh Arizona territory. The smell of coffee and bacon drifted from several chimneys, mixing with the dry desert air that promised another scorching day ahead. Tommy burst into the main trading post where several men had gathered around a wooden table, drinking coffee and discussing the previous night's poker game. His sudden entrance caused every conversation to stop immediately. The boy's appearance told a story before he even opened his mouth. His clothes were torn. There was dried blood on his shirt that clearly wasn't his own, and his small hands shook uncontrollably. "Please, sir," Tommy gasped, looking directly at Marshal Jim Clayton, a weathered man in his 50s with graying hair and kind but tired eyes. "They took my daddy, sir. The Apache came in the night and they took him away." The silence in the room was deafening. Every man present understood the gravity of what the boy was saying. Apache raids had been increasing in frequency over the past several months, and each incident seemed more violent than the last. The peace treaties that had been signed years ago seemed to mean nothing now, and tensions between the settlers and the Apache tribes had reached a dangerous breaking point. Marshal Clayton immediately knelt down to the boy's level, his hands gently gripping Tommy's shoulders. "Slow down, son," he said in a calm voice that masked his growing concern. "Tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning." Tommy took several shaky breaths before he could speak coherently. "We were sleeping in our cabin near Miller's Creek. Daddy always kept his rifle by the bed because he said we had to be ready. I heard noises outside like horses moving around real quiet-like. Then Daddy woke up and told me to hide under the bed and not make any sound no matter what happened." The boy paused, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. The men in the room exchanged worried glances, but no one interrupted. They all knew this story could provide crucial information about Apache movements in the area. "I crawled under the bed like Daddy told me," Tommy continued, his voice getting smaller. "Then I heard them come inside. There were 3 of them, maybe 4. They didn't say nothing at first, just looked around with their faces painted up real scary. One of them had a big scar across his cheek, and another one wore a necklace made of what looked like teeth." Marshal Clayton felt his stomach tighten. He had heard descriptions of these particular Apache warriors before, and if his suspicions were correct, this was the work of a renegade band led by a warrior known as Black Wolf. This group had broken away from the main tribe and refused to honor any peace agreements. They had been responsible for several brutal attacks on isolated homesteads over the past year. "What happened next, Tommy?" Clayton asked gently, though he dreaded hearing the answer. "Daddy tried to reach for his rifle, but they were too quick. One of them hit him with something heavy and he fell down. I wanted to help him, but I remembered he told me to stay hidden no matter what. They tied his hands behind his back and dragged him outside. I could hear him telling them that if they wanted to hurt someone, they should hurt him and leave me alone." The boy's voice broke completely at this point, and Marshal Clayton pulled him into a protective embrace. The other men in the room stood in respectful silence, many of them fathers themselves who could imagine the horror of being in either Tommy's or his father's position. After a few moments, Tommy pulled back and continued his account. "They put Daddy on one of their horses and rode away toward the mountains. I stayed under the bed until the sun came up because I was too scared to move. Then I ran here as fast as I could because Daddy always said if anything bad happened, I should come find you, Marshal Clayton." Clayton stood up slowly, his mind already working through the implications of what he had just heard. Miguel Martinez was a good man who had settled in the territory 3 years ago after his wife died of fever. He had worked hard to build a decent life for himself and his son, and he had never caused trouble with anyone, Indian or white. This wasn't about revenge or territorial disputes. This was something else entirely. "How long ago did this happen, son?" Clayton asked. "They took him when the moon was still high in the sky," Tommy replied. "I think maybe 4 or 5 hours ago." Clayton felt a surge of hope. If the boy was right about the timing, there might still be a chance to track the Apache band before they reached the more treacherous mountain terrain where following them would become nearly impossible. But he also knew that pursuing Apache warriors into their own territory was extremely dangerous, even for experienced trackers. The marshal turned to address the other men in the room. "I need volunteers for a tracking party. We need to move fast if we're going to have any chance of getting Miguel back alive. But I won't lie to you, this is going to be dangerous. Black Wolf's band doesn't take prisoners to negotiate with them. They have other plans." Several men immediately stepped forward despite the obvious risks. In a frontier community like Pine Ridge, every person mattered, and abandoning one of their own to Apache raiders was simply not an option. They all understood that if they didn't respond to this attack, it would only encourage more raids on other isolated homesteads. As the men began gathering supplies and weapons for the pursuit, Tommy tugged on Marshal Clayton's sleeve. "Can I come with you? I know the way to our cabin, and I can show you exactly which direction they went." Clayton looked down at the brave little boy and felt his heart break a little. The child had already been through more trauma than most adults could handle, but his determination to help rescue his father was both admirable and heartbreaking. "I appreciate your courage, Tommy," Clayton said carefully, "but this is going to be very dangerous. The best way you can help your daddy right now is by staying here in town where it's safe. Mrs. Henderson will take good care of you while we're gone." The boy's face fell with disappointment, but he nodded reluctantly. Deep down, he understood that he would only slow down the rescue party and possibly put everyone in greater danger. Still, the thought of waiting helplessly while his father remained in Apache hands was almost unbearable. Within an hour, Marshal Clayton had assembled a tracking party of 6 experienced men. There was Jake Morrison, a former cavalry scout who knew Apache tactics better than anyone in the territory. Bill Henderson ran the general store but had served as a ranger for 10 years before settling down. Frank Rodriguez was a local rancher, whose own spread had been raided twice in the past year. Tom Wilson worked as a blacksmith but had tracking skills that rivaled most professional hunters. Finally, there was Dr. Samuel Hayes, who insisted on coming along in case they found Miguel Martinez alive but injured. The group gathered at the edge of town just as the sun reached its peak in the cloudless sky. Each man carried enough supplies for 3 days along with plenty of ammunition and water. They all understood that once they entered Apache territory, they would be operating under the enemy's rules, where every rock formation could hide a warrior and every canyon could become a trap. Jake Morrison took the lead as they rode toward the Martinez cabin. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes constantly scanned the horizon for any signs of movement. He had fought against Apache warriors for most of his adult life, and he knew better than anyone how quickly a routine tracking mission could turn into a fight for survival. The Martinez cabin sat in a small clearing about 5 miles from Pine Ridge. When they arrived, the scene confirmed everything that young Tommy had told them. The front door hung open on broken hinges, and furniture inside had been overturned during the struggle. Most telling were the clear hoof prints in the soft dirt around the cabin, showing exactly where the Apache horses had been positioned during the raid. Morrison dismounted and began examining the tracks with the careful attention of someone whose life had often depended on such details. 4 horses, he announced after a few minutes. "Unshod like we expected. The prints are still sharp, so Tommy was right about the timing. They've got maybe a 5-hour head start on us." Marshal Clayton felt a mixture of hope and dread. 5 hours was manageable if they pushed hard, but it also meant they were definitely heading into the mountains where the Apache would have every advantage. "Which direction?" he asked. Morrison pointed toward a range of red sandstone cliffs that rose dramatically from the desert floor about 10 miles to the north. "Straight toward Eagle's Peak. That's Black Wolf's territory, just like we figured. The good news is there's only one main trail up into those rocks. The bad news is that trail goes through Devil's Canyon, and if they're planning an ambush, that's where they'll set it up." Dr. Hayes adjusted his medical bag and checked his rifle for the 3rd time since leaving town. "How do we know Miguel is still alive? Why would they take him prisoner instead of just killing him at the cabin?" It was a question that had been bothering Marshal Clayton as well. Apache raiders typically killed quickly and moved on, especially when they were operating so close to a settlement. Taking a prisoner only slowed them down and created additional risks. There had to be a specific reason why they wanted Miguel Martinez alive. Frank Rodriguez had been examining the cabin's interior, while the others studied the tracks outside. "Marshal," he called from the doorway, "you need to see this." Inside the cabin, Rodriguez pointed to a wooden chest that had been forced open and thoroughly searched. Papers were scattered across the floor, and it was clear that the Apache had been looking for something specific. Among the scattered documents, Clayton found several official-looking papers with territorial government seals. Miguel was working as a translator for the Indian Bureau, Clayton realized as he studied the documents. These are records of treaty negotiations and land surveys. If Black Wolf's band got hold of this information, the implications hit everyone at the same time. Miguel Martinez hadn't been taken as a random prisoner. He had been specifically targeted because of his work with the territorial government. The Apache must have learned about his involvement in recent treaty negotiations, and they wanted to extract information from him about government plans for their traditional hunting grounds. Jake Morrison spat into the dust and shook his head grimly. This changes everything. If they took him for information, they'll keep him alive until they get what they want. But once they're done with him, he didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that Miguel's specialized knowledge was probably the only thing keeping him alive. And once the Apache extracted that information, they would have no more use for him. The tracking party mounted up and began following the trail toward Eagle's Peak. The Apache horses had maintained a steady pace, not rushing but not wasting time either. Morrison noted that they seemed confident they weren't being followed immediately, which suggested they might not have lookouts posted on their back trail. That could work in the rescue party's favor if they could close the distance quickly enough. As they rode across the increasingly rugged terrain, Marshal Clayton found himself thinking about the broader implications of this situation. If Black Wolf's renegade band was specifically targeting government employees and their families, it meant the conflict was escalating beyond simple raids for supplies or revenge. They were gathering intelligence for something much larger and more dangerous. The trail led them through a series of dry washes and rocky outcroppings that provided excellent cover for anyone who might be watching. Morrison called for frequent stops to study the tracks and scan the surrounding area for signs of an ambush. The Apache were masters of using terrain to their advantage, and rushing blindly into a trap would help no one. About halfway to the base of the mountains, they came across a waterhole where the Apache had stopped to rest their horses. The tracks around the muddy edges told a more detailed story than anything they had found at the cabin. Morrison knelt beside the water and studied the impressions carefully. "They're not pushing their horses hard," he reported. "Looks like they stopped here for maybe half an hour. If I'm reading this right, they've got one prisoner riding double with one of the warriors, which matches what we expected." Tom Wilson pointed to some scuff marks in the dirt near the water's edge. "Looks like someone was sitting here. Could be where they let Miguel rest and maybe gave him some water." The fact that the Apache were keeping their prisoner in relatively good condition was encouraging news. It suggested they planned to keep him alive for an extended period, which gave the rescue party more time to catch up. But it also meant they were probably heading to a permanent camp rather than just a temporary hideout, which would make a rescue attempt much more complicated. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain became increasingly challenging. The desert floor gave way to rocky slopes covered with scrub brush and scattered boulders. The Apache trail became harder to follow, as the horses moved across solid rock surfaces that showed few clear prints. Morrison had to rely more on broken twigs, disturbed pebbles, and other subtle signs that most people would never notice. Dr. Hayes was beginning to show the strain of the hard riding. As the town's physician, he spent most of his time indoors and wasn't accustomed to long hours in the saddle across rough country. But he gritted his teeth and kept up with the others, knowing that Miguel Martinez might desperately need medical attention by the time they found him. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon when they finally reached the base of Eagle's Peak. The mountain rose nearly straight up from the desert floor, its red sandstone walls broken by narrow canyons and ledges that could hide an army of warriors. Somewhere up in those rocks, Black Wolf's band was holding Miguel Martinez prisoner. Morrison studied the cliff face through a pair of field glasses, looking for any signs of movement or smoke that might indicate the location of the Apache camp. "There," he said finally, pointing to a narrow canyon that cut deep into the mountain's eastern face. "See that dark opening about halfway up? That's got to be Devil's Canyon. If they're following the main trail, that's where they went." Marshal Clayton felt his stomach tighten as he studied the canyon entrance. It was the perfect place for an ambush. a narrow passage between high walls where a few warriors could hold off a much larger force. If Black Wolf had posted guards there, the rescue party would be walking into a trap with no way to retreat. As darkness began to fall across the desert, Marshal Clayton made the difficult decision to make camp at the base of Eagle's Peak, rather than attempt to navigate Devil's Canyon in the dark. Jake Morrison agreed completely with this choice, knowing that trying to track Apache warriors through unfamiliar mountain terrain at night would be suicide. They found a defensible position among a cluster of large boulders about a quarter-mile from the canyon entrance. The rocks provided cover from 3 sides while still allowing them to watch the trail they had been following. If any Apache scouts came down from the mountains during the night, they would have advance warning. While the other men set up a cold camp with no fire, Morrison climbed to the highest boulder to study the canyon walls through his field glasses. The fading light made it difficult to see details, but he could make out what appeared to be a thin column of smoke rising from somewhere deep within the canyon system. "They're up there," he reported when he climbed back down. "Saw smoke about 2 miles in, probably from their main camp. The good news is they're not trying to hide their location, which suggests they feel pretty secure. The bad news is getting to them is going to be a real challenge." Dr. Hayes opened his medical bag and checked his supplies one more time. "Assuming we can reach Miguel, what kind of conditions should we expect to find him in? I need to know what I'm dealing with." Morrison's expression was grim. Apache interrogation methods aren't gentle. If they've been questioning him about government plans for several hours, he's probably been hurt pretty badly. They use pain to break down resistance, and they're very good at keeping someone conscious and able to talk even when they're in agony. The thought of what Miguel Martinez might be enduring at that very moment made every man in the group more determined to reach him as quickly as possible. But they all understood that rushing blindly into Devil's Canyon would likely result in all of them being killed or captured, which wouldn't help Miguel at all. Frank Rodriguez had been studying a hand-drawn map of the area that he had borrowed from the Territorial Surveyor's office. According to this, Devil's Canyon has 3 main branches once you get about a mile in. If we take the wrong one, we could wander around in there for days without finding their camp. Marshal Clayton examined the map by lamplight, noting the various trails and landmarks that might help them navigate the treacherous terrain. "We'll have to follow the trail Morrison has been tracking. The Apache horses will lead us right to their camp, assuming we can get that far without being spotted." Tom Wilson was sharpening his knife with slow, methodical strokes. "What's our plan once we locate their camp? Are we trying to sneak in and grab Miguel? Or are we going in shooting?" It was a question that Clayton had been wrestling with since they left Pine Ridge. 6 men against an unknown number of Apache warriors in their own territory was not good odds under any circumstances. A direct assault would probably result in everyone being killed. But a stealth approach would be extremely difficult in the rocky terrain where every footstep could send loose stones clattering down the canyon walls. "We scout first," Clayton decided. "Once we know how many warriors we're dealing with and where they're holding Miguel, we can make a plan. But our primary goal is to get him out alive, not to win a battle against Black Wolf's entire band." Morrison nodded his approval. "Smart thinking. Apache camps usually have guards posted, but they rely mostly on the terrain to protect them. If we can identify the guard positions and figure out when they change shifts, we might be able to slip in during the confusion." As the night deepened, the men took turns standing watch while the others tried to get some rest. The desert air grew cold quickly once the sun disappeared, and they huddled in their blankets while listening to the distant sounds of coyotes howling in the mountains above them. During his watch shift, Dr. Hayes found himself thinking about Tommy Martinez, probably lying awake in Mrs. Henderson's spare bedroom and wondering if he would ever see his father again. The boy had already lost his mother to disease, and now he faced the possibility of being completely orphaned in a harsh frontier territory, where life was difficult enough for families with 2 parents. Around midnight, Morrison thought he heard the sound of horses moving somewhere up in the canyon, but the noise was too faint and distant to be certain. He woke Marshal Clayton quietly, and they both listened carefully for several minutes, but the sound wasn't repeated. It could have been Apache scouts checking their back trail, or it might have been wild horses or other animals moving through the rocks. When dawn finally broke over the mountain peaks, the rescue party was ready to move. They had eaten a cold breakfast of hardtack and jerky, checked their weapons thoroughly, and studied the canyon entrance one more time through Morrison's field glasses. In the clear morning light, they could see that the trail they had been following definitely led straight into Devil's Canyon. Morrison took point as they entered the narrow passage between towering sandstone walls. The canyon floor was covered with loose rocks and sand that made it impossible to move quietly, but they had no choice except to follow the Apache trail. Every step could potentially be heard by guards posted on the canyon rim high above them. The walls gradually closed in as they moved deeper into the mountain, creating an oppressive feeling of being trapped. The morning sun couldn't reach the canyon floor, leaving them in a world of shadows and echoing sounds. Every small noise seemed magnified in the confined space, from the creak of saddle leather to the soft snorting of their horses. About a mile into the canyon, Morrison held up his hand to signal a halt. He dismounted and examined the trail carefully, noting that the Apache tracks were fresher here and showed signs that the horses had been moving more slowly. He also found clear boot prints in a patch of soft sand, evidence that Miguel Martinez had been walking at this point rather than riding. "They made him walk from here," Morrison whispered to the others. "Probably wanted to tire him out and make him less likely to try escaping. The good news is the tracks are only a few hours old. We're definitely closing the distance." Marshal Clayton felt a surge of hope mixed with growing anxiety. They were getting close to the Apache camp, which meant the most dangerous part of their mission was just beginning. Once they located Miguel, they would have to figure out how to extract him from the middle of a hostile camp without getting everyone killed in the process. The canyon began to branch into multiple passages. Just as Frank Rodriguez's map had indicated, Morrison studied the ground carefully before choosing the middle branch, following the clearest set of Apache tracks. The walls here were even higher and more sheer, creating perfect positions for warriors to rain down arrows or rifle fire on anyone passing below. As they rode deeper into the heart of Eagle's Peak, each man understood that they were now completely committed to their course of action. The canyon was too narrow to turn around easily, and retreat would be almost impossible if they encountered Apache warriors coming down from above. Their only choice was to keep moving forward and hope they could find Miguel Martinez before Black Wolf's band discovered they were being pursued. The sound of voices speaking in Apache reached them before they saw the camp. Morrison immediately signaled for everyone to dismount and led them to a position behind a large boulder where they could observe without being seen. About 200 yards ahead, the canyon opened into a natural amphitheater surrounded by high rock walls. Smoke from several small fires drifted up through the morning air. Through Morrison's field glasses, Marshal Clayton could see the Apache camp spread across the relatively flat area. There were 8 warriors that he could count, along with about a dozen horses grazing near a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks. Several crude shelters had been constructed from branches and animal hides, suggesting this was more than just a temporary camp. "There," Dr. Hayes whispered, pointing toward the far side of the camp. "Is that Miguel?" Clayton adjusted the field glasses and focused on a figure sitting against the canyon wall with his hands tied behind his back. Even at this distance, it was clearly Miguel Martinez, though he appeared to be in rough condition. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and his head hung forward as if he was barely conscious. Morrison studied the camp layout carefully, noting the positions of the guards and the various escape routes. "I count 8 warriors, but there could be more in the shelters. 2 guards posted on that ledge about 50 feet up the wall, and at least 3 more moving around the camp. The others are probably sleeping after being up most of the night." Frank Rodriguez was examining the terrain between their position and the camp.
"How do we get down there without being seen?"
"It's all open ground once we leave these rocks." The approach to the Apache camp was indeed problematic. The canyon floor offered very little cover, and the guards on the elevated ledge had a clear view of anyone approaching from their direction. A frontal assault would be detected long before they could reach Miguel, and the Apache would have plenty of time to either kill their prisoner or use him as a human shield. "We need a distraction," Clayton decided after studying the situation for several minutes. "Something to draw their attention away from Miguel long enough for a couple of us to reach him." Tom Wilson had been quietly examining the canyon walls above the Apache camp. "What if we could create a rock slide? There are some loose boulders up there that look ready to come down with the right encouragement. A few well-placed rifle shots might bring down enough rock to cause confusion and maybe take out some of their guards. Morrison considered this suggestion carefully. A rock slide would certainly create chaos in the Apache camp, but it was also extremely dangerous for everyone involved, including Miguel. If the rocks came down in the wrong place, they could easily kill the man they were trying to rescue. Too risky, he concluded. Miguel is positioned right under those loose rocks. A slide could crush him before we ever get the chance to free him. Dr. Hayes had been watching the activity in the camp through his own small pair of field glasses. It looks like they're preparing for some kind of ceremony or ritual. See how they're arranging those items near the fire? I think they're getting ready to interrogate Miguel more seriously. Clayton felt his stomach tighten as he realized what the doctor was suggesting. If the Apache were preparing for an extended interrogation session, it meant Miguel's time was running out quickly. Whatever information Black Wolf wanted from him, they were obviously planning to extract it today, and they wouldn't be gentle about it. We have to move now, Clayton decided, before they start seriously hurting him. Morrison nodded grimly. Here's what we'll do. Rodriguez and Wilson will work their way around to the left side of the canyon and get into position about 100 yards from the camp. When I give the signal, they'll open fire on the guards on that ledge. The noise and confusion should draw most of the warriors toward their position. He pointed to a narrow ledge that ran along the right wall of the canyon. Hayes and Henderson will take the high route along that ledge and provide covering fire from above. That leaves you and me, Marshall, to go straight down the middle and grab Miguel while everyone else is distracted. It was a dangerous plan with many things that could go wrong, but it was probably their best chance of rescuing Miguel before the Apache killed him. Each man checked his weapons one final time and made sure he understood his role in the upcoming assault. Frank Rodriguez and Tom Wilson began working their way carefully around the left side of the canyon, using what little cover was available to avoid being spotted by the Apache guards. It took them nearly an hour to reach their designated position, moving slowly to avoid dislodging loose rocks that might alert the enemy to their presence. Dr. Hayes and Bill Henderson faced an even more challenging task as they climbed up to the narrow ledge that would give them a shooting position above the Apache camp. The ledge was barely wide enough for one person, and loose stones made every step treacherous. One slip could send them tumbling down the canyon wall, but they pressed on knowing that Miguel's life depended on their success. While the others moved into position, Marshall Clayton and Jake Morrison studied the Apache camp one more time, looking for any changes in the guard positions or activities that might affect their plan. The warriors near the fire were definitely preparing for something, arranging various tools and implements that looked distinctly threatening. One of the Apache warriors walked over to where Miguel was sitting and kicked him roughly in the ribs, apparently trying to wake him up for whatever ordeal they had planned. Miguel raised his head slowly, showing a face that was bruised and swollen from previous beatings. Even from their distant position, Clayton could see that the man was in serious pain. Morrison checked his pocket watch and calculated how long it had taken the others to reach their positions. Give them another 10 minutes to get settled, then we move. Once the shooting starts, we'll have maybe 2 or 3 minutes before they figure out what's happening and start organizing a real defense. Clayton nodded and began mentally rehearsing the route they would take to reach Miguel. The canyon floor offered several large boulders that could provide cover during their approach, but there would be at least 50 yards of completely open ground that they would have to cross while under fire. As they waited for the attack to begin, Clayton found himself thinking about young Tommy Martinez back in Pine Ridge. If this rescue attempt failed, the boy would be left completely alone in the world. That thought gave Clayton additional determination to succeed, no matter what the personal cost might be. The first rifle shot cracked across the canyon like thunder, followed immediately by several more as Rodriguez and Wilson opened fire on the Apache guards. The warriors on the elevated ledge were caught completely by surprise, and one of them tumbled from his position with a cry of pain. Chaos erupted in the Apache camp as warriors scrambled for their weapons and tried to identify where the attack was coming from. Some ran toward the left side of the canyon where Rodriguez and Wilson were positioned, while others took cover behind rocks and began returning fire. Now, Morrison shouted, and he and Clayton burst from their hiding place and began running toward the camp using the confusion to mask their approach. The sound of gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, making it difficult for anyone to determine exactly where all the shots were coming from. The battle for Miguel Martinez's life erupted with devastating suddenness. Clayton and Morrison sprinted across the open canyon floor while bullets whined past them and ricocheted off the rocky walls. Above them, Dr. Hayes and Henderson had reached their position and were laying down covering fire that forced several Apache warriors to take cover. Miguel looked up in confusion as the gunfight exploded around him. His eyes were swollen nearly shut from beatings, but he seemed to recognize Marshal Clayton as the lawman dove behind a boulder just 20 feet away from where he was tied. The Apache warrior who had been guarding him immediately grabbed a rifle and began shooting at Clayton's position. Morrison came at the camp from a different angle, his rifle barking steadily as he advanced from boulder to boulder. He had fought Apache warriors many times before, and his experience showed in the way he moved, always staying low, never exposing himself for more than a few seconds, and making every shot count. The Apache were fierce fighters, but the surprise attack had disrupted their organization and scattered them across the camp area. Black Wolf himself emerged from one of the shelters, his face painted for war and a cavalry saber gleaming in his hand. He began shouting orders in Apache, trying to rally his warriors and coordinate their defense. Clayton saw his chance when the warrior guarding Miguel turned to fire at Morrison's position. The marshal broke from cover and sprinted the final 20 feet, tackling the Apache warrior before he could turn around. They rolled across the rocky ground, fighting desperately for control of the warrior's rifle. The Apache was strong and experienced in hand-to-hand combat, but Clayton's desperation gave him extra strength. He managed to wrench the rifle away and use the butt to strike the warrior in the head, stunning him long enough to reach Miguel's position. "Can you walk?" Clayton shouted over the noise of the gunfight as he began cutting the ropes that bound Miguel's hands. Miguel's voice was hoarse and weak, but his eyes showed fierce determination. "Get me a gun and I'll crawl if I have to. These animals killed my neighbor's family last month." Clayton pulled out his backup pistol and pressed it into Miguel's hands just as another Apache warrior appeared around the side of a large rock. His war lance raised to strike. Miguel, despite his injuries and exhaustion, managed to fire twice quickly. The warrior stumbled and fell, his lance clattering across the stones. From their elevated position, Dr. Hayes and Henderson were doing their best to provide covering fire, but they were running low on ammunition and the Apache had figured out their location. Several warriors were now climbing up toward their ledge, forcing them to divide their attention between shooting and defending their own position. Rodriguez and Wilson were holding their ground on the left side of the canyon, but they were facing at least 4 Apache warriors, who were using the rocky terrain to work closer to their position. The 2 men were experienced fighters, but they were gradually being forced back toward the canyon wall with nowhere to retreat. Morrison had reached the center of the Apache camp and was engaged in a running gunfight with Black Wolf himself. The Apache leader was a formidable opponent who seemed to anticipate Morrison's movements and counter them effectively. They circled each other among the rocks and shelters, each looking for an opening to finish the other. "We need to get out of here," Clayton yelled to Morrison as he helped Miguel to his feet. The rescue had been successful, but they were now trapped in the middle of an Apache camp with warriors closing in from all directions. Morrison fired his last shot at Black Wolf and then began reloading quickly. "The way we came in is blocked. We'll have to try the back canyon and hope it leads somewhere." Clayton could see that Morrison was right. Several Apache warriors had positioned themselves between the rescue party and the canyon entrance they had used to approach the camp. Their only chance of escape was to try one of the other canyon branches, even though none of them knew where those passages led. Black Wolf had reloaded his own rifle and was advancing steadily toward Morrison's position. The Apache leader's painted face showed no emotion, but his eyes burned with hatred for the white men who had invaded his stronghold. He raised his rifle and took careful aim at Morrison's chest. The shot came from above as Dr. Hayes managed to hit Black Wolf in the shoulder, spinning him around and spoiling his aim. The Apache leader snarled in pain and anger but didn't go down. Instead, he shifted his rifle toward the doctor's position and began climbing toward the ledge where Hayes and Henderson were trapped. Miguel was moving under his own power now, though he was obviously in considerable pain from his injuries. "There's another way out," he gasped as they stumbled toward the back of the canyon. "They brought me in through a narrow passage behind those rocks. It's hidden, but it leads back toward the desert." Clayton felt a surge of hope. If Miguel was right about the hidden passage, they might be able to escape without having to fight their way back through the main canyon, where more Apache warriors might be waiting in ambush. Morrison was covering their retreat, firing carefully aimed shots to keep the Apache warriors at a distance. He was down to his last few rounds of ammunition, and he knew that once his rifle was empty, they would be in serious trouble. Rodriguez. Wilson, Clayton shouted across the canyon. Fall back to our position. We found another way out. The two men heard the marshal's call and began fighting their way back toward the center of the camp, leapfrogging from rock to rock while providing covering fire for each other. Wilson took an arrow in his left arm but kept moving, gritting his teeth against the pain. Dr. Hayes and Henderson were in the most dangerous position, trapped on their narrow ledge with Black Wolf and two other warriors climbing steadily toward them. The doctor had used most of his ammunition and was down to his medical instruments as weapons. Henderson was trying to hold off the Apache with his rifle while helping Hayes find a way down from their exposed position. Miguel led Clayton and Morrison toward the back wall of the canyon, where a narrow crack in the rock face was partially hidden by fallen boulders and desert brush. There, he pointed with a shaking hand. That's where they brought me in. It's tight, but a man can squeeze through. The passage was barely wide enough for one person, and it disappeared into darkness after just a few feet. There was no way to know where it led or whether it was even passable all the way through. But with Apache warriors closing in from all directions, they had no choice but to try it. Hayes. Henderson, Morrison called up to the trapped men on the ledge. Jump down here. We'll catch you. Dr. Hayes looked down at the 20-foot drop and swallowed hard. It was a dangerous jump that could easily result in broken bones, but staying on the ledge meant certain death when Black Wolf reached their position. Henderson pushed him toward the edge. Go, I'm right behind you. The doctor closed his eyes and leaped, landing hard in Clayton's arms and knocking both men to the ground. Henderson followed immediately, but as he jumped, Black Wolf appeared at the edge of the ledge above and fired down at them. The bullet caught Henderson in the leg, sending him spinning as he fell. Morrison caught Henderson and immediately began dragging him toward the hidden passage. Can you walk? He asked quickly. Henderson's face was pale with pain, but he nodded grimly. I can make it. Don't worry about me. Rodriguez and Wilson had fought their way back to the group, both men bleeding from minor wounds but still mobile. Wilson's arm was nearly useless, but he could still shoot with his right hand. Rodriguez had taken a bullet graze across his ribs that was bleeding steadily, but didn't seem to be life-threatening. Into the passage, Clayton ordered. Miguel first, then the wounded men. Morrison and I will cover the rear. Miguel squeezed into the narrow opening, his injured body protesting every movement. Dr. Hayes followed, then Henderson, who had to be helped through the tight space because of his wounded leg. Wilson and Rodriguez went next, supporting each other as they disappeared into the darkness. Black Wolf and his remaining warriors were advancing rapidly across the camp, firing as they came. Bullets sparked off the rocks around the passage entrance as Clayton and Morrison prepared to follow the others into the unknown tunnel. Go, Morrison shouted to Clayton. I'll hold them off for another few seconds. Clayton squeezed into the passage and immediately found himself in complete darkness. The tunnel was so narrow that his shoulders scraped against both walls, and he had to move forward by feeling his way along the rough rock surfaces. Behind him, he could hear Morrison's rifle firing one last time, before the sound of the scout squeezing into the passage entrance. The hidden tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning through the heart of Eagle's Peak. In some places, it was so narrow that they had to turn sideways to pass through. In others, the ceiling was so low that they had to crawl on their hands and knees. The wounded men groaned with pain as they forced their injured bodies through the restrictive space. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Miguel called back from somewhere ahead in the darkness. I can see light. We're almost out. The tunnel gradually widened and became lighter as they approached the exit. One by one, the members of the rescue party emerged from a crack in the rocks on the far side of Eagle's Peak, blinking in the bright desert sunlight. They found themselves in a small canyon that led down toward the desert floor, completely hidden from the Apache camp they had just escaped. Dr. Hayes immediately began examining the wounded men, while the others kept watch for any signs of pursuit. Henderson's leg wound was serious but not life-threatening, and Wilson's arm could be treated once they reached town. Miguel was in the worst condition, showing signs of severe dehydration and multiple injuries from his captivity. Can you ride? Clayton asked Miguel as they prepared to move toward their horses, which they had left hidden at the base of the mountain. Miguel straightened up despite his pain and managed a weak smile. "Marshall, after what I've been through, I could fly back to Pine Ridge if I had to. Let's go home." The journey back to Pine Ridge proved to be almost as challenging as the rescue itself. With 3 wounded men and horses that were exhausted from the hard riding of the previous day, the group could only travel at a slow pace across the desert terrain. Dr. Hayes did his best to treat the injuries with his limited medical supplies, but everyone understood that proper treatment would have to wait until they reached town. Miguel Martinez was struggling to stay conscious as they rode through the afternoon heat. The combination of his injuries, dehydration, and the stress of his captivity had taken a severe toll on his body. Several times, Marshal Clayton had to reach over and steady him in the saddle to prevent him from falling. "Tell me about Tommy," Miguel whispered during one of their rest stops. "Is he safe? Did they hurt him?" Clayton felt a wave of relief as he reassured the injured man. "Tommy is fine. He's the one who came to get help when the Apache took you. That boy showed more courage than most grown men would have in his situation." A weak smile crossed Miguel's battered face. His mother always said he was brave. She would be proud of how he handled himself. His voice trailed off as memories of his deceased wife brought both comfort and sadness. Jake Morrison was constantly scanning the horizon behind them, watching for any signs that Black Wolf's warriors might be following their trail. The Apache leader had been wounded in the fight, but not seriously enough to put him out of action. Morrison knew that Black Wolf would not simply let the rescue party escape after such a humiliating defeat in his own stronghold. "They're coming," Morrison announced grimly as he spotted a dust cloud in the distance through his field glasses. "Looks like 4 or 5 riders, maybe 2 miles back. They're moving fast and closing the distance." The news sent a chill through the entire group. In their current condition, with wounded men and tired horses, they couldn't hope to outrun pursuing Apache warriors across open desert. They would have to find a defensive position and make a stand, even though the odds would be heavily against them. Frank Rodriguez pointed toward a low ridge about half a mile ahead. "There are some rocks up there that might give us cover. If we can reach that position, we might be able to hold them off until help arrives." It was a slim hope, but it was better than trying to fight in the open desert where the Apache would have every advantage. Clayton made the decision to push for the rocky ridge, even though it meant riding their exhausted horses harder than was safe. Tom Wilson's wounded arm was making it difficult for him to control his horse effectively, and Dr. Hayes had to stay close beside him to provide assistance. Bill Henderson's leg wound was bleeding again from the hard riding, leaving a trail of blood drops on the desert sand that would make it even easier for the Apache to follow them. As they climbed toward the ridge, Miguel suddenly straightened in his saddle and pointed back toward the pursuing dust cloud. "Wait," he said, his voice stronger than it had been all day. "I know that country behind us. There's an old mine shaft about a mile to the east of here. The entrance is hidden, but it goes deep into the hillside." Morrison considered this information quickly. A mine shaft could provide excellent defensive cover, but it could also become a trap if the Apache managed to block the entrance. However, given their current situation, it might be their best option. "How well do you know this mine?" Morrison asked. "Is there another way out?" Miguel nodded weakly. "I helped survey that area for the territorial government. There are at least 2 entrances, maybe 3. The main shaft goes back about 300 feet and connects to several smaller tunnels." Clayton made the decision immediately. "We'll try for the mine. If we can get inside and find a defensive position, we might be able to hold out until they give up and go back to their stronghold." The group changed direction and rode hard toward the east, following Miguel's directions toward the hidden mine entrance. Behind them, the Apache pursuit was getting closer, and they could now hear the distant sound of horses' hooves pounding across the hard-packed desert soil. The mine entrance was well concealed behind a screen of rocks and desert brush, just as Miguel had described. It would have been almost impossible to find without someone who knew exactly where to look. The opening was large enough for horses, which meant they could bring their mounts inside and prevent the Apache from stealing them. "Everyone inside, quickly," Clayton ordered as they reached the mine. "Morrison, can you cover the entrance while we get organized?" Morrison positioned himself behind a large boulder near the mine opening and began watching for the Apache pursuit. The dust cloud was much closer now, and he estimated they had perhaps 10 minutes before Black Wolf's warriors reached their position. Inside the mine, the temperature was noticeably cooler, and the darkness provided welcome relief from the blazing desert sun. Dr. Hayes immediately began working on the wounded men by lamplight, using his medical supplies to clean and bandage their injuries properly for the first time since the rescue. Miguel was examining the mine tunnels, trying to remember the layout from his survey work several years earlier. The main shaft goes straight back for about 200 feet, then branches into 3 smaller passages. 2 of them are dead ends, but the third one comes out on the far side of the hill. The sound of approaching horses echoed from outside the mine, followed by voices speaking in Apache. Black Wolf and his warriors had found their hiding place, but they seemed uncertain about whether to enter the dark tunnels where they would lose their mobility advantage. Morrison crawled back from the entrance and reported to the others. 5 warriors, including Black Wolf. They're positioned around the entrance, but they haven't tried to come inside yet. I think they're planning to wait us out and force us to come to them. Clayton realized that Black Wolf was being smart about this pursuit. The Apache leader knew that the rescue party couldn't stay in the mine forever without food and water, and he probably assumed that some of them were wounded and growing weaker. By controlling the entrance, he could force them to surrender or die of thirst. "How long can we hold out in here?" Dr. Hayes asked as he finished treating Henderson's leg wound. Wilson checked their remaining supplies. "We've got maybe 1 day's worth of water for all of us and almost no food. If those Apache are willing to wait, they'll have us in about 24 hours. Miguel was studying the mine tunnels more carefully, holding a lamp as he examined the rock formations and air currents. "I think I remember now. The back entrance isn't just an opening. It's actually a natural cave that connects to the mine workings. If we can reach it, we'll come out in a canyon about 2 miles from here." Morrison considered the tactical situation. How many men would it take to guard that back entrance? If Black Wolf is smart, he'll send some of his warriors around to block our escape route. Miguel shook his head. He'd have to know about the back entrance first, and it's not obvious from the outside. The opening is hidden behind a waterfall that only flows during the spring runoff. This time of year, it just looks like a crack in the rocks. Clayton felt a surge of hope. If they could reach the back entrance without being detected, they might be able to escape while Black Wolf and his warriors were still watching the main entrance. It was risky, but it was better than waiting in the mine until they died of thirst. "We'll try it," Clayton decided. "Miguel, can you lead us through the tunnels to the back entrance?" Miguel nodded, though the effort of moving was obviously causing him considerable pain. "I'll do my best, Marshal. For Tommy's sake, I'll get us out of here." The escape through the mine tunnels tested every man's courage and endurance. Miguel led them deeper into the mountain, following passages that hadn't been used by humans for several years. The air grew thin and stale, and their lamplight created eerie shadows on the rough rock walls. Dr. Hayes stayed close to Miguel, ready to catch him if his injuries caused him to collapse. The man was running on pure determination now, driven by the thought of seeing his son again. Every step was obviously painful, but he never complained or asked to rest. Behind them, they could hear the distant sound of Apache voices echoing through the main mine shaft. Black Wolf had apparently decided to send some of his warriors into the tunnels to search for them, which meant their escape route could be discovered at any moment. "How much farther?" Wilson whispered, cradling his wounded arm against his chest. Miguel paused at a junction where 3 tunnels branched off in different directions. For a moment he seemed confused, and Clayton felt his heart sink. If Miguel couldn't remember the correct route, they could wander in these tunnels until they died of thirst, or worse, until the Apache found them. "This way," Miguel said finally, pointing to the tunnel on the right. "I remember now. There's a section where the ceiling gets very low. Then it opens up again near the back entrance." They crawled through a section where the tunnel roof was barely 4 feet high, forcing them to move on their hands and knees while leading their horses behind them. The wounded men groaned with pain as the rough movement aggravated their injuries, but everyone understood that stopping was not an option. Morrison was bringing up the rear, listening constantly for sounds of pursuit. The Apache warriors were definitely in the tunnels now, and their voices seemed to be getting closer. He estimated they had perhaps a 10-minute head start, which wasn't much when you were moving through unfamiliar underground passages. The tunnel finally began to slope upward, and they could feel a slight breeze carrying the scent of desert air. Miguel's face showed the first sign of hope they had seen since entering the mine. "We're almost there," he whispered. "The back entrance is just ahead." They emerged from the mine through a narrow opening hidden behind a dry waterfall, just as Miguel had described. The canyon beyond was completely empty of Apache warriors, suggesting that Black Wolf hadn't discovered this escape route. For the first time in hours, Clayton allowed himself to believe they might actually make it back to Pine Ridge alive. The horses were exhausted, and the men were barely able to stay in their saddles, but they pushed on across the desert toward home. Miguel was unconscious now, held upright in his saddle by rope that Dr. Hayes had rigged to prevent him from falling. His breathing was shallow but steady, and the doctor was cautiously optimistic about his chances for recovery. As the sun began to set behind the western mountains, they finally saw the wooden buildings of Pine Ridge appearing in the distance. The sight brought tears to several men's eyes, as they had begun to wonder if they would ever see their homes again. Tommy Martinez was the first person to spot them approaching the settlement. The boy had been watching from the roof of Mrs. Henderson's house every day since they left, refusing to believe that his father was gone forever. When he saw the group of riders approaching with one man tied to his saddle, he knew immediately that his prayers had been answered. "Daddy," Tommy shouted as he jumped down from the roof and ran toward the approaching horses. "Daddy, you're alive!" Miguel opened his eyes at the sound of his son's voice and managed a weak smile. "Tommy," he whispered, "I told you I'd come back." The reunion between father and son brought tears to every man present. Clayton helped Miguel down from his horse and into Tommy's waiting arms, while Dr. Hayes began making arrangements to move the injured man to his medical office for proper treatment. Word of the successful rescue spread quickly through Pine Ridge, and soon a crowd had gathered to welcome the heroes home. Women brought food and medical supplies while men offered to care for the horses and equipment. The entire community had been holding its breath since the rescue party left, and the relief was overwhelming. Mrs. Henderson took charge of Tommy, making sure the boy had food and clean clothes while his father received medical attention. "You were so brave," she told him as she prepared a hot meal. "Your daddy is going to be very proud when he hears how you handled yourself." In Dr. Hayes' office, Miguel was finally receiving the medical care he desperately needed. His injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and the doctor was confident that he would make a full recovery with proper rest and treatment. More importantly, his spirit had not been broken by his ordeal with the Apache. Marshal Clayton gathered the other members of the rescue party to discuss what they had learned about Black Wolf's activities. The intelligence that Miguel had been forced to provide under torture was concerning, as it suggested the renegade Apache band was planning something much larger than random raids on isolated homesteads. "We need to send word to the territorial capital," Clayton decided. "If Black Wolf is gathering information about government survey plans and military positions, he's probably planning a major attack on one of the larger settlements." Morrison agreed completely. This rescue mission was just the beginning. Black Wolf won't forget what happened at his stronghold today, and he'll be looking for revenge. Every settlement in this territory needs to be warned about what's coming. As the evening progressed and the immediate medical emergencies were handled, the community of Pine Ridge settled into a well-deserved celebration. The successful rescue had proved that they could work together to protect their own, even against the most dangerous enemies. Tommy Martinez sat beside his father's bed, holding the injured man's hand and telling him about everything that had happened while he was gone. Miguel listened with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed with gratitude for the brave men who had risked their lives to bring him home. "Marshal Clayton," Miguel said as the lawman prepared to leave the doctor's office, "I can never repay you for what you did today. You saved my life, but more importantly, you saved my son from becoming an orphan." Clayton tipped his hat respectfully. "We take care of our own here in Pine Ridge, Miguel. That's what makes this place worth defending." Outside, the desert night was peaceful and quiet, with no sign of Apache raiders on the horizon. But everyone in Pine Ridge understood that this was only a temporary calm. Black Wolf and his warriors were still out there somewhere, planning their revenge and gathering strength for whatever attack they were preparing. The lone Apache had asked his question and received his answer. Now it remained to be seen what that answer would cost the people of Pine Ridge in the days and weeks to come. But for tonight, at least, a father and son were reunited, and a community had proved that courage and determination could overcome even the most desperate odds. Tommy Martinez fell asleep in the chair beside his father's bed, his small hand still clutching Miguel's fingers. The boy had learned hard lessons about courage and loss during his father's captivity, but he had also learned that sometimes, when good people work together, Even the darkest situations can have happy endings.